Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. We're still at the beginning of our scenery phase. We're doing a lot of building work today. Sticking around the main midway like we did with the last episode. Today I'm focusing on the large building that goes around the main midway in Lakeside Midway, which houses a lot of midway games and also some backlot facilities. So pretty huge section here at the beginning of the park, so we're going to focus on getting that knocked out. Took me a couple iterations to get some designs here. As I mentioned, with pretty much every one of these creative builds I do, it's taken me a lot of iterations to get something that is half decent. And like I said, I think a lot of these building designs that I'm doing today are still like first drafts. Definitely a lot of buildings in here that I'm not totally happy with, but I wanted to get something down and we can come back and improve on them later. Building creatively like this is definitely different when I'm recording it as opposed to just doing it kind of casually on my own. I think making this into a series has really kind of affected the way that I build, which is kind of weird when you think about it. Since everything I'm doing is being recorded, I kind of feel like I am obligated and pressured to build things quickly, get things done, and that definitely results in builds that are not as good or as detailed as I would like. As I've mentioned before, I do want to make this build as good as I possibly can. I do want to make these buildings look detailed, look nice, and I don't think I'm quite doing that. I don't quite feel like that what I've done here in this episode is quite up to my standards. I am happy to get a lot of this stuff done for sure, but I'm definitely gonna come back and rework some of these designs later, I think. It's definitely a problem with trying to recreate real life buildings. Making them look good in RCT is difficult. It's really tempting and easy to just use like base blocks and plain walls for everything, which is what you see me doing a lot in here, just because it's very fast and easy to make something that looks half decent. At least it'll get you the right shapes and colors for a lot of buildings. But they're not very detailed, so they don't look quite as good as if you actually spend a lot more time on making some nice details. So going forward, we'll probably see me throw down some buildings like we're doing here today that are maybe not necessarily going to look fantastic. And I'll probably do some off-camera work doing some more detailing because I like to look up some reference parks. I've got a handful of non-custom scenery parks I like to use for references and inspiration for buildings and path decorations and little set pieces and things like that. And if I'm not recording myself, it's going to be a lot easier to use those. I won't feel like I'm wasting time going back and forth looking for inspiration and jumping around in the park doing different bits of the build at different times. Hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. This kind of creative work, it can be very difficult, and I don't know if this strategy of doing it on a video series like this is necessarily going to give me the best results. I do want to put as much of this I can into the YouTube series, so you get to see as much of it as possible, but don't be alarmed if we come back in future episodes and things look a little bit different from the build that you see in the previous episode, since I might be tweaking things off camera just to try to get them to look a little bit nicer. Anyway, we're definitely seeing a lot of that today with these very large buildings, especially this huge L-shaped one that has got the midway games and the backlot area. One of the main things we have going on here is that the player sees the roofs of these buildings, and in real life the roofs are very plain. A lot of them are just like plain white with maybe some AC units coming off them. But from an RCT standpoint, that's not particularly interesting to look at. I play around a little bit with adding some different textures to the roofs here, but I think I go a little bit overboard in some places, and I think I need to dial it back a little bit or find some different strategies to make things look a little bit less messy. We do have lots of options for how this could go. I just haven't found what I think is the perfect way yet. It was actually a little bit refreshing to do some of the backlot stuff today. Since this is a maintenance area that the public is generally not allowed to go into, there are no photos of it that I could find. So I'm just using the aerial Google imagery to get a reference of what the backlot looks like, which doesn't give me a great idea of what's all back here. You see some buildings, you see a lot of parked cars, but there's not a lot of good quality photos, so it's hard to tell what a lot of this stuff actually is. So it gave me some opportunity to be a little bit creative without being restricted by what's in real life compared to usual, which was actually kind of nice. So we could just throw down some little decorations in here without having to worry too much about if it's perfectly accurate to the real world. That did lead a little bit to some of our back roads here as well, connecting the maintenance area to the main parking lot. There's a service road that connects these together. Not a whole lot of decoration needed for this area, so I threw down some fences and diagonal bits as well. So things are looking pretty cool over here. Pretty happy with the way this turned out so far. With the way the layout of the whole park went, there wound up being a little bit too much space between these roads and the rides and everything. So I think I've got a little bit of extra green space to fill here, probably add some extra trees in here that don't exist in real life, but that's okay. That will probably wind up looking pretty good anyway. So not too upset about that happening. Also, as part of our backlot decoration, there is parking back here for staff, obviously. So I added some parked cars and trucks and things like that back here. This is pretty easy to do with Bassie's vehicle editor plugin. So big shout outs to Bassie as always for the great tool. It's really tedious to add all the vehicles in a parking lot like this, but you know, it's worth the effort because they look pretty cool when they're all in there. I've got about 45 vehicles in this lot and it took forever though, so I'm really not looking forward to when we get to the public parking lot where I think I'm going to have, you know, hundreds of cars probably. And coloring and moving all of those by hand is going to take 100 years. That might also be something I'll do off camera. I don't know. It's going to be very tedious work. But I think it'll be worth it in the end. I think that having a nice big full lot of cars always looks nice, especially when you have a pretty good variety of different vehicles in there. But yeah, after all that, the backlot is looking pretty decent. It's still pretty empty just because it's so big, and I'm not really sure what else I can throw down in here to make it look a little bit more interesting. It's unfortunate that the vantage point of the RCT player is different than that of the real-life Cedar Point attendee, so we have to add some weird details to things like this backlot that normally we wouldn't care about. But that's what happens when you do a recreation, I guess. So yeah, later on we'll go on in here and add some more little bits and bobs to help make this area a little bit more interesting, probably. After wrapping up the backlot for today, I did also throw down some builds for the remaining shops on the right side of the main Midway. We've got some different food stalls here and some souvenir shops. And as I mentioned before, these are kind of preliminary first draft builds as I was trying to get something done kind of quickly. I do kind of like how the ice cream shop and the Starbucks turned out. I think they look pretty decent, but of course that's because they're using a little bit more than just base blocks and plain walls. Definitely adds a little bit more interest to the buildings, but it's tough when the real life buildings really aren't too terribly interesting and you have to kind of make them interesting in RCT. There's also one building back here that is blocked off from the public. I believe it used to be a shop called Lotsapalooza, and there's now a wall in front of it, according to the photos that I was able to find from more recent years. I'm not sure if it is even used for anything anymore, if it's now like a staff building or something else. So I decided to just kind of decorate it in the same way that it used to be, based on the Google Street View photos from like 10 years ago. Hopefully eventually I can get a better idea of what that building is actually used for and what it looks like. It looks a little bit weird standing all by itself without a lot of decoration to indicate what it is. It just looks kind of silly. But yeah, a lot of these backlot areas are just very tough to decorate. It's hard to know what they're supposed to look like, what goes back here. So I think later on when I go and add a little bit more detail, I'll just have to be a little bit creative and think of some different things to throw down in that back area. So it's not all just a bunch of footpath that looks very boring. I think that's gonna cover it for today. Thanks for listening to my long-winded ramble. Hopefully you have a little bit of a better understanding of kind of the process of making these kinds of creative scenery bits and everything. And it kind of makes a bit more sense as to why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. It does feel pretty good to knock out a big chunk of buildings today, get a lot of that red grid out, even if the buildings aren't totally up to my standards quite yet, but I know they're gonna get there eventually. We're gonna do some more work on them. It's just going to take some time, but I'm looking forward to cleaning these up and getting more of them done. I think we're making good progress so far. And you know, I'm still learning as I go, learning new techniques, learning new little strategies, and coming up with new ideas for different kinds of decoration things. So hopefully the farther along we get, the better I will get at making these buildings. And when we're done, everything will be up to my standards, I guess you could say. But yeah, that will do it for today. And as always, if you got any comments, questions, suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.